StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session on philosophers from the West. In the past few sessions we've talked about philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then we went in for Stoics and Epicureans. As I said in the last session, we have to understand certain fundamental principles on the basis of which these philosophers came up with their philosophies. The ultimate objective of all the philosophers was the good of mankind, the good of human being. And that they determined from their understanding of ethics. The whole purpose of ethics was to understand what was right and what was wrong. All ethics is about right and wrong. Or you can put it, what is good and what is bad. They were all in agreement that they were working for the good of human beings. But the key question was, how? And that's where the differences approach. Because none of the philosophers want anything bad for human beings. They all wanted good for human beings. They wanted them to live happily, but the approach on how to lead a happy life, on how to lead a good life was very different. So they looked at, as I see all the Western philosophers and perhaps even Indian philosophers, there are three levels at which they looked at. One was, as I call, the spiritual level. The second was at the intellectual level. And the third was senses. So when we spoke of Plato, Aristotle, they were talking more in terms of the ethereal world, the spiritual world. This is not to say they were disconnected with the intellectual world or senses, but they prominently were at the spiritual level. Even during the age of Christ or the theologians, they also talked of spiritual world. So the good and bad emanated from their understanding of what the Almighty said. In case of Plato, it was not God, it was something else. But in case of theologians, everything that flew or that flowed from the Almighty, the God, the Jesus Christ, that was considered to be right. So the justification of any action was whether it was in consonance with their theological principles. Again, as I keep saying, it is not that they were disconnected with the intellectual. Because if you look at some of the past philosophers, they were talking of reason. It's not that they were irrational, so to say, but as in the case of theologians, they defined the reason through God. Then the third category was those of senses. These were so-called empiricists, meaning thereby they came to conclusions on the basis of what they saw and felt. Anything physical. So this was more physical. This was spiritual, this was intellect, which is reason. If you understand this hierarchy properly, you will be able to understand all the philosophers. Because to my mind, all of them can be put in one of these categories. Again, I am repeating, categories do not mean that they were not basing their arguments also on intellectual or senses, because even Aristotle came to his conclusions based on what he saw. But he related it to the spiritual concept, the reason part. So when we understand this, it is in this context we look at the philosophers that we are going to discuss today. Now this is much later in the history. We had discussed Greek philosophers in 3rd and 4th century BC. Now we have come to the 18th century, the 19th century, and a lot has happened in between. Whole revolution, so to say, has come about in the understanding of the universe. There are new things that have come. People have observed lot many things, and now reason is overtaking myths. Dominant reason. So the whole world has undergone a change. This is an era of enlightenment. So they were not looking at something ethereal. They were trying to justify their arguments on the basis of what they saw, and then they reasoned it out. But even here, you have differences. Whereas the deontologist, primarily Immanuel Kant, we'll discuss Immanuel Kant, was basing his entire philosophy on intellectual. He was basing it on reason. It's not that those that were looking at senses or the physical part were not basing it on reason, but this became the ultimate objective of them. So all justification came from what suited the senses, and that's where the utilitarians came is. With this background, we'll take you today to two very important philosophies of that era. One was called the Deontology, the other is Utilitarianism. You know, initially when I was preparing this presentation, I had used the term consequentialism in place of utilitarianism. But as I studied more of this philosophy, I realized that consequentialism is just a part of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is much bigger than consequentialism, though of course in the fundamental understanding, if you understand the basic concepts of deontology and consequentialism, then you'll understand the difference between two major philosophies. Okay, so with this background, let us look at how the philosophers of the Enlightenment looked at what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, because ethics is all about determining what is right and what is wrong. We start with this wonderful philosopher who has influenced so many philosophies thereafter as well, and he is still regarded as one of the finest philosophers that has ever lived on earth, and that was Immanuel Kant. Now, he was himself very religious. He was a Christian. But over a period of time, he found that all our actions have to be determined and to be based on reason, not on somebody else somewhere sitting somewhere else trying to tell us what you should do. You should do what you should do. It should be based on reason. And he went on to explain that. And he says that we are all rational beings. Human beings are rational. If you recall my previous presentations, I talked about how that animals are not rational animals. They have their senses to respond to their senses as they feel. But human beings can reason, they can argue, they have intellect, and that's why they're different. So you don't have to necessarily borrow your principles from religion. Because somebody is saying something, you should do it. No, it's not because you feel that is right, and through reason you come to this conclusion that this is right and this is wrong. And that is why Immanuel Kant worked on what is good and what is right, and all that is determined based on reason. There are few principles that are very, very important in case of Immanuel Kant. And that's why his philosophy is called Deontology. Deo actually means duty. Only such action can be right as conformed to your duty. And this obligation for you to do that right is not determined by something external. It is internal. Because you feel that is right, you do it. Because it is good for you, you do it. And that's why it's called deontology. So this is a very important aspect. You do things because it is right for you and you think it is right for you. It is not based on any consequence of what is the consequence of your action. So if you have to be truthful, that's your duty to be truthful, irrespective of the consequence. As we'll discuss in the subsequent slide, when we talk about utilitarianism, there the consequence is important. Here consequence is totally immaterial. So you will, something which is right, irrespective of whatever be the consequence or what that action is. So you cannot tell a lie. For example, in a house, if there are robbers that are coming in and they have some grouse against the head of the family there, the wife opens the door. Now the wife has an option to save her husband by saying that her husband is not at home. But then she's telling a lie because the guy is there. Immanuel Kant will say, no, you tell them he is at home. Your duty is to never tell a lie. And if that be the duty, you have to do that, irrespective of the consequences thereof. He argues that husband could be killed even otherwise. Even if you tell he's not there, robbers are not going to stop. They're going to barge in and see if he's there. If he's not there, find him and they will kill him. But if you tell a lie, then you become guilty of that offense. One may not agree with it, but that's the logic that Kant used, that a duty is a duty is a duty, and you have to follow that duty. Hence, intention is crucial. It's not the end. Mahatma Gandhi also said that, as you sow, so shall you reap. This is also biblical. There's a lot in Kant which is biblical. So we have to understand, though they are saying the same thing, but the rationale or the basis on which, or the obligation to do that, is not determined by someone sitting outside or someone sitting above. It's from within. You decide through reason that ultimately that is beneficial for you. You reason it out, and that's why you do it. So adoption of that is much easier because you get to feel that it is beneficial to you. So intention is the key, no matter what be the consequences. Another example to you. There has been an accident and someone is admitted in the hospital. He has a weak heart and he was traveling tragically with his son who passed away. Now, the question is whether when you visit him, do you tell him that he's lost his son? Immanuel Kant will say, yes, you should say that. But that could lead to the death of that individual because he has a weak heart. If you tell him now, when he's already ailing, the chances that he will die. But Kant says no. A utilitarian will stop there. He will not say. But a Kant will tell him that you lost your son. The other alternative, I'm just for the sake of argument, is just keep quiet. He doesn't ask you to tell him. You don't go and tell him yourself. But if you are asked, then you can't tell a lie. So consequences don't matter. It is your intention that matters. Then you come to a very important concept of categorical imperative. What is categorical imperative? How do you determine whether an act is ethical or not? An act is ethical if that particular action can be universalized. So, for example, telling a lie is universally unacceptable. And hence, it is imperative for you not to tell a lie. It's again another biblical or Christian concept of do unto others what you would have them do to you. Do unto others what done to you. Now, this is what is called the golden principle. So, Kant adopts that golden principle from Christendom, but he justifies it based on reason, not because somebody else has said it. So, that's the difference. The conclusions are by and large the same, the morality is the same, but the rationale is different. Kant says categorical imperative is any action that can be universalized. This then goes to another step, and that another step is law. So, a priori, Kant feels that anything that is enacted law is actually enactment of a universal principle which is universally applicable. If a principle is not universally applicable, it cannot be called ethical. So, any action which you think is right and you do it should be such that that principle should become applicable to others. So, for example, if you go to a shop and you are stealing something from there, would you allow somebody else to do the same in your shop? You would not. So, that's not a categorical imperative because it's not universally applicable. And it is from this that he derives the authority of the state. Now, there is a bit of a contradiction here because Kant treats every individual as an end, not as a means. A very, very important aspect. Now, what is happening here as a consequence of emancipation that is happening during that time, as a consequence of enlightenment that is happening, freedom of individual assumes a critical importance. So, an individual without his own willingness cannot be treated as a means to an end. So, is the humanism of Kant that is coming up. Again, because he treats every individual as unique, a very important aspect. Of course, an individual can willingly do a particular job, that is fine with him, that is his choice, he does that, but you cannot ill-treat him. Again, this is coming from the Christendom, where they emphasize the whole concept of equality, the importance of human being. But here, again, the logic that Immanuel Kant used is more of reason rather than somebody else telling him to do that. Now look at against this. This becomes very important and apparently contradictory because laws are articulation of categorical imperative. Now something which is universally acceptable then gets articulated law, formalized in a law, and hence he believes that individuals should obey the state because state is an embodiment of categorical imperative in the sense that whatever has been universally acceptable becomes the law. So basically what we're looking at Immanuel Kant is the concept of deontology, that is what is good or what is right is something which is your duty, and this duty is based on reason. And how is that duty to be performed? It has to be performed on the basis of any action that can be universally applied becomes a categorical imperative, and that when becomes a part of law, every individual is obliged to obey that law. Kant was very particular about freedom of individuals, which gets highlighted at this point. But he said that your freedom doesn't mean that you deprive somebody else the freedom. So you can push your head like this, hand like this, but if somebody else is standing there, you can't hit him because then you're depriving him of his freedom. You are hitting him. So your freedom has to be limited in that sense, and that is where all that is acceptable by the society becomes a part of the law. So this is what Immanuel Kant said. Now let us come to utilitarianism. This is the other part, the other end of it. Whereas Kant said, you do what is good because that is good. Your duty as a part of your duty, irrespective of the consequences. Utilitarians went to the other end. So again, if I look at that hierarchy of spiritual, intellectual, and senses. Kant stood here because he was using reason. You have utilitarians coming here. Now the difference here was that Kant, a duty is a duty irrespective of the consequences. For utilitarians, it all mattered what actually was the consequence, and that is why they were sometimes called consequentialist. But utilitarian was much beyond. Let us understand what are the principles. Some people call utilitarianism as hedonism, which is a component of utilitarianism, because whether it was J.S. Mill or Jeremy Bentham, both proponents of utilitarianism, it was maximizing the pleasure of an individual. But then they went step one ahead, maximizing pleasure of maximum number of people. Hedonism is more individual in nature. Pleasure and pain is the only determinant for an individual. So utilitarianism cannot just be hedonist, because utilitarianism is going beyond pleasure of individual. Of course, the fundamental principle is the same. Evaluating each action based on outcomes, whether it increases happiness. So if it increases anything you do, leads to a better consequence, do that. You are not doing that because that action itself is good, as Kant would. Here you are taking an action because ultimately the consequences thereof are good. So in the same example as of a hospital where you go to tell, where somebody is asking you whether his son is alive or not after an accident, a utilitarian will tell a lie, because he knows he wants to save the life of that gentleman, because telling the truth doesn't help anybody. He might himself die. So utilitarianism will look at the consequences of the action, because it will make him unhappy if you tell him that. A truth will make him unhappy, you will not tell the truth. A Kant will tell the truth irrespective of the fact whether it makes somebody happy or unhappy. Here they will not, because it makes him unhappy. So it's the hedonistic principle of doing something which increases pleasure over pain. That's the fundamental principle. But they go in for aggregation. So it's not hedonism is for individual. Aggregation is for a group. And that's where utilitarianism is much beyond hedonism. Hedonism is individual. Utilitarianism all aggregate a number of individuals. And in fact, Jeremy Bentham worked out a calculation. He could actually determine that if so many people feel so much happy, so the happiness could be between 0 and 10, so they will keep adding the happiness They will cease subtracting the happiness and total it and find out whether ultimately it makes the group more happy. So whereas hedonism relates to only an individual, here we are looking group, and that's what utilitarianism is. And finally, there is consequentialism, which I mentioned earlier. So it can't be just consequentialism. It has to, that consequential action leads to pleasure and pain, and then you aggregate them together. So utilitarianism is much beyond just consequentialism. It is much beyond just aggregation. It is much beyond just hedonism. It is a combination of these. It is the pleasure and pain of individual, and then you add them together. But that itself, pleasure and pain, is as a consequence of an action. So action is totally immaterial. What is material is the outcome thereof. So each one of you should understand this very, very clearly. Now let us look at the key concepts here. What are the key concepts of utilitarianism? Now, what is the ultimate good? That is what we said in hedonism, that whether an action leads to more pleasure or less pleasure. If it leads to more pleasure, then you do it. If it leads to lesser pleasure, you don't do it. As simple as, they had simplified the entire ethical philosophy to numbers. No one had done that before. Now we are looking at numbers. Bentham felt that it could be actually calculated. One may disagree with him because it is so subjective in nature that sometimes it's very difficult to calculate pleasure. But the advantage thereof is that you have some objective parameter of determining what is right and what is wrong, because whatever philosophies that we have studied earlier, they are all very, very subjective. Here utilitarianism is reducing that subjectivity. It is not becoming totally objective, but at least you can clearly, to some extent, determine what is more and what is less. Otherwise, in all the philosophies, it's totally subjective. So that's what they say, ultimate good. Then net positive action. So it is quite possible that you show a movie to somebody, maybe 20 people, 5 of them will like it a lot, 4 of them will like it somewhat, some of them will not like it. So how do you determine whether it is giving them more pleasure or less pleasure? You will just calculate and see, okay, 5 rate it at say 9, so you say 45 marks. Similarly, the other 5 rated as 3, so another 15 marks. So these are positive marks. Then you come to the next one and say they disliked it. To what extent? You'll say -5, so -25. So you'll calculate it accordingly, and then you'll total and see whether it is net positive or net negative. It is net positive, you go ahead with that action. If it's net negative, you know, many of the companies today use that as an understanding of the impact of what they're doing. They do an impact analysis, somewhat subjective, but then you, over a period of time, they develop certain parameters through which they determine what is good, what the people like. That's the utilitarian concept. Whether it is giving them greater pleasure or lesser pleasure. There is one, of course, this greatest happiness of greatest numbers, meaning thereby this calculus, this calculation gives you a broader picture of what is right and what is wrong. One thing that utilitarianism evolved, and this you see in John Stuart Mill. Bentham was not so particular about this, but J.S. Mill came up that there could be different type of pleasures. So, for example, there could be a physical pleasure and there could be an emotional happiness. Now, it was felt, and if you recall, when we're doing Stoics and Epicureans, even in the case of Epicureans, we came to this understanding that they have different levels. You know, the pleasures or the happiness that lasts longer is a better one than immediately. So, for example, eating ice cream, you have an immediate pleasure of eating it, but if your throat is gone for a toss, then there's a long-term impact thereof. So, this of course is just physical, but there could be an emotional part. You indulge in a sexual activity which is unethical in nature. At that point in time, you may enjoy it, but later on it creates so many scars. So, it's unhappy. Ultimately, it is unhappiness. Now, Bentham was not so particular, didn't go into those details, but John Stuart Mill talked about lower pleasures and higher pleasures. So, this is the basic difference between these two. Let us try and see a comparison. Some of it I have spoken as I was mentioning earlier, but now let us see, put them together. What did Immanuel Kant say? Let us understand deontology very clearly, that focus is on duty, on your intention. Then he talks about categorical imperative. Categorical imperative, which I mentioned earlier also, is universalization of an action which you think is correct. If any action can be universalized, equally applicable to everyone, then it becomes necessary for everyone. You can universalize it. And of course, autonomy of individuals. Kant was very particular about freedom of individuals, and he talked about it. Look at what J.S. Mill says. Now, J.S. Mill was provided an evolved form of utilitarianism. Of course, consequentialism. It has to be ultimate determinant of good or bad is the consequence of your action. Action itself has absolutely no meaning. That's what he said. What happens thereafter, what is the consequence, is the real thing. Then, of course, the greatest happiness of greatest principle. To Kant, it didn't really matter whether it's greatest number. For Kant, it was just the duty, if you're doing your duty. Now, what he felt was that something which is universally acceptable would be the greatest happiness of greatest number, because that is what they should do. But that is an assumption. He was not bothered about greatest numbers. It was felt that if anything that is good universally, everyone will be happy with it. But that's an assumption. Here, there is a calculation, whether it is greatest happiness or greatest number. And obviously, the utilitarians are much more pragmatic in nature. In fact, you can relate to utilitarianism much more than you can relate to Kant, because Kant talks about duty, the a priori requirement of any action, whereas utilitarianism, you can actually measure it. So friends, that was it. This was about Kant. This was about J.S. Mill, Jeremy Bentham. I hope you enjoyed this session. We'll come back later on. Thank you. All the best.
StudyIQ IAS. आपका सिलेक्शन, हमारा मिशन।